March 15, 2017. Frank Bronson had been in solitary confinement for 2,547 days. Cell 47B measured exactly 6 feet by 9 feet, the same measurements as the prison cell set he'd helped build for Concrete Angels. The movie that destroyed his life. That Tuesday morning, a new guard slid an unmarked DVD under his door. No words, no explanation, just 23 minutes of raw footage from the last day of filming. Footage that was supposed to have been destroyed in the fire. Frank watched himself die on camera. Then he watched the real killer walk away. For 7 years, he'd protected his daughter Sarah by staying silent about what really happened on that set. 7 years of believing the lie. 7 years of letting Hollywood's biggest secret rot in a 6x9 concrete box. The footage changed everything. Someone had been playing the long game. Someone wanted him to see the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The DVD player's blue glow painted shadows across Frank's weathered face as he rewound the footage for the 15th time. His hands shook, not from age, but from rage that had been building pressure like steam in a boiler for 7 years. There. Frame 432. Director Marcus Webb collapsed against the fake concrete wall, blood pooling beneath his head. But the camera angle showed what the jury never saw. Webb's eyes tracking movement off-screen, his mouth forming a single word before the light left them. A name Frank couldn't quite make out, but he knew it wasn't his. Frame 447. Frank's own stunt double, hired last minute when Frank called in sick that morning, dragged Webb's body deeper into the shadows. The double wore Frank's signature leather jacket, the one Sarah had bought him for his 50th birthday. The same jacket the prosecution had found covered in Webb's blood. Frank pressed pause, his finger trembling against the remote. He'd never called in sick. The food poisoning that kept him home that final day had come from the craft service's breakfast burrito. The same breakfast he'd eaten on set for 3 months without incident. Someone had poisoned him. Someone had ensured he wouldn't be there when Webb died. Someone had dressed his double in his jacket and filmed the murder, then burned the evidence. Almost all of it. The cell's fluorescent light flickered, casting the same sickly pallor he remembered from the movie set. Pelican Bay's architect had consulted on Concrete Angels, ensuring maximum authenticity. Frank was living in a replica of his own movie set, serving time for a crime committed in a fake prison cell that looked exactly like his real one. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hollywood had always blurred the lines between reality and fiction. Now those lines had erased him completely. His daughter's last letter sat unopened on the metal shelf beside his bunk. Sarah wrote every month, but Frank hadn't read her words in 3 years. Reading them made the silence harder to maintain, made the lie more difficult to swallow. She was 26 now, a prosecutor in San Francisco, following in the footsteps of the man she believed had murdered her father's friend. The man who'd raised her alone after her mother's overdose when Sarah was 12. The man she visited less and less frequently until the visits stopped altogether. Frank had let her hate him. It was easier than watching her destroy her career trying to prove his innocence. But someone had changed the rules. The footage proved Frank wasn't the killer, but it raised darker questions. Who was the double? How had they accessed the closed set? Why murder Webb during filming instead of making it look like an accident off camera? Frank had spent 7 years assuming Webb's death was about money, a studio insurance scam, or revenge over creative differences. Hollywood feuds turned deadly weren't unprecedented, but this felt orchestrated beyond simple murder. Someone had wanted Frank specifically in this cell. Someone had engineered his food poisoning, arranged for the double, planted the evidence, and then, most telling of all, built his prison to match his movie set. The level of planning suggested resources beyond what any individual could manage. Frank thought about the new guard who'd delivered the DVD. Young, nervous, different from the usual rotation. He'd avoided eye contact and left quickly, like a man delivering a message he didn't understand but feared. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Frank's case had been mentioned in a documentary about wrongful convictions last month. Sarah had been interviewed, still defending his innocence after all these years. Her segment had aired nationally. Someone was watching. Someone had decided it was time for Act 2. Frank ejected the DVD and slid it under his mattress. Tomorrow would bring the usual routine: breakfast slop, exercise hour in the concrete yard, dinner slop, lights out. But tonight, for the first time in 2,547 nights, Frank Bronson wasn't the same man who'd been locked in cell 47B. Tonight he was remembering who he'd been before the conviction, before the silence, before he'd chosen his daughter's future over his own freedom. He'd been Hollywood's premier stuntman for 23 years. He'd survived car crashes, building explosions, and 3 divorces. He'd doubled for action stars whose names appeared on movie posters while his was buried in end credits. He'd built a career on taking risks other men wouldn't consider. Frank pulled out a piece of paper and began writing his first letter to Sarah in 3 years. Someone had started a new game, and they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd given him evidence that could free him and destroy whoever had orchestrated his imprisonment. But first, he needed to find out who'd sent the DVD and why they'd chosen now to reveal the truth. The game had changed, but Frank Bronson was done being anyone's victim. After 7 years of silence, it was time to fight back. Tomorrow we dive deeper into Frank's past and uncover the first shocking connection between his conviction and Hollywood's most protected secrets. Don't miss what happens when he makes contact with the outside world. Someone has been waiting 7 years for this moment. Introduction. Frank's pen hovered over the blank paper, the weight of 3 years' silence pressing against his chest like a physical thing. The fluorescent bulb above his bunk hummed its familiar tune, the same frequency that had scored his sleepless nights since arriving at Pelican Bay. He'd counted those hums. 847,320 cycles of artificial light marking time in a concrete box that Hollywood had designed to break men's spirits. "Dear Sarah," he finally wrote, then stopped. "How do you apologize to your daughter for becoming a stranger? How do you explain 7 years of choosing silence over truth when the truth could have set him free but destroyed her?" The letter from Sarah lay unopened beside his elbow, her familiar handwriting spelling out his name and number with the careful precision she'd inherited from her mother. Rebecca had written the same way, measured, deliberate, as if words were evidence in a case she couldn't afford to lose. Sarah was 26 now, older than her mother had been when overdose claimed her in their Malibu kitchen while Frank was on location, performing a helicopter stunt for a forgettable action sequel. He'd found Rebecca 3 days later, Sarah curled up beside her mother's cold body, surviving on cereal and tap water, whispering stories to keep the silence away. 14 years old and already learning that the people you love most can vanish without warning, leaving only questions that cut deeper than any blade. Frank had raised Sarah alone after that, declining stunts that required extended travel, turning down bigger paydays to be home for school plays and soccer games. He'd taught her to throw a punch and change a tire, helped her with calculus homework between takes on movie sets where she did her studies in director's chairs, while he fell from buildings and crashed through windows for other men's glory. Sarah had been his redemption after Rebecca's death, proof that he could protect someone who mattered, that his hands could create something besides controlled destruction. When she graduated law school, she'd hugged him so tight he felt his ribs compress, whispering that she'd become a prosecutor to fight for people like her mother, victims of a system that abandoned the vulnerable. The irony burned like acid in his throat. Sarah was now part of the same justice system that had railroaded him, believing in law and order because she'd seen what happened when both collapsed. She still wrote because she'd inherited her mother's stubborn loyalty. But Frank knew she'd stopped visiting because watching him rot in a cage was killing her slowly, the way Rebecca's pills had killed her, 1 dose at a time until hope stopped breathing. Frank's cell was 8 feet by 12 feet, the exact dimensions of the solitary confinement set from concrete angels. The toilet was positioned in the same corner, the sink mounted at the identical height. Even the scratches in the concrete walls matched the distressed patterns the art department had carved for authenticity. Someone had recreated his movie prison with obsessive precision, trapping him inside his own artistic collaboration. Marcus Webb had insisted on realism for concrete angels, consulting with former inmates and prison architects to capture the crushing psychological weight of isolation. Frank had spent months in this replica cell during filming, memorizing every surface, every shadow, Every way the acoustics turned whispers into shouts and shouts into suffocating echoes. Now those same walls pressed against him 24 hours a day, a constant reminder that his career had built his own tomb. The coffee Frank sipped was instant crystals dissolved in lukewarm water from the sink, bitter as regret and twice as dark. It was nothing like the craft services coffee from movie sets. That perfect French roast that had sustained him through 18-hour shooting days and impossible stunts that should have killed him 12 times over. But Frank had always been lucky until he wasn't. 23 years of cheating death on camera, only to be destroyed by a murder he didn't commit in a prison that didn't exist when the crime occurred. Webb had been more than Frank's director. He'd been the closest thing Frank had to a best friend in an industry that treated friendships like contract negotiations. They'd worked together on 7 films, Webb always insisting Frank perform the most dangerous sequences personally, because Frank's fearlessness elevated every scene. Webb had been Sarah's godfather, attending her high school graduation when Frank's broken ribs from a motorcycle stunt kept him bedridden. The night before Webb's murder, they'd shared drinks in Frank's trailer, planning stunts for the following week's shooting. Webb had seemed nervous, checking his phone constantly, mentioning problems with studio executives who wanted script changes that would compromise the film's integrity. He'd asked Frank about retirement plans, whether he ever considered leaving Hollywood for someplace quiet where the past couldn't follow. Now Frank understood that conversation differently. Webb hadn't been discussing abstract futures. He'd been saying goodbye. "I've been protecting you by staying silent," Frank wrote on the paper, his handwriting rougher than he remembered. "But someone else has been playing a longer game than either of us realized." The pen slipped from Frank's fingers as footsteps echoed in the corridor. Wrong rhythm, wrong time. Guards walked these halls with mechanical precision, but these steps carried hesitation, uncertainty. Frank pressed his ear to the cold metal door, listening to approaching chaos disguised as routine. Bronson. The voice belonged to Officer Martinez, but something cracked beneath his usual authority. "You've got a call." Frank's blood turned arctic. 7 years without phone privileges, 7 years of absolute communication silence, and suddenly Martinez stood at his door jingling keys like wind chimes in a storm. Prison calls required advance approval, background checks, administrative paperwork that moved slower than geological time. Nothing happened spontaneously in Pelican Bay's Supermax unit. What kind of call? Frank stepped away from the door, his mind cataloging possibilities, discarding each one as impossible. "Legal, your lawyer." Martinez's keys scraped against the lock, but Frank caught the tremor in his hands. "Says it's urgent, about new evidence." Frank hadn't spoken to his public defender since the appeals process died 3 years ago. Robert Chen had fought harder than most court-appointed attorneys, but even Chen had eventually advised Frank to accept reality, life imprisonment with possibility of parole in 30 years. Chen had stopped returning Sarah's calls, stopped filing motions, stopped believing in miracles that never materialized. The corridor stretched ahead like a concrete throat, swallowing Frank's footsteps as Martinez led him toward the administrative wing. Other inmates pressed against their cell doors, watching Frank's unprecedented journey with eyes that had forgotten surprise. In Supermax, routine was religion. Deviation meant someone was either dying or escaping. The phone booth was a plexiglass coffin with a black handset that felt heavier than any stunt equipment Frank had ever lifted. Through the scratched transparent barrier, Martinez stood with his back turned, but Frank noticed his shoulders rigid with tension that suggested he was listening to every word. "Frank?" Chen's voice carried 7 years of accumulated exhaustion. "Jesus Christ, I can't believe I'm making this call. Chen, what the hell?" "Listen carefully. Someone sent me a package this morning. No return address, postmarked yesterday from Los Angeles. Inside was a DVD and a letter explaining how to contact you immediately." Chen's breathing sounded labored, like a man who'd been running from something that kept pace easily. "Frank, I've watched the footage 5 times. You're innocent." Frank's vision narrowed to pinpricks of light dancing across the plexiglass. "What footage?" "From the day Webb died. Someone filmed the entire murder, Frank. The real killer is wearing your jacket, but it's not you. The face is visible in 3 frames. I've already sent stills to a forensics expert I trust. We can prove this wasn't you." The phone booth spun like a carnival ride. Frank gripped the handset tighter, his knuckles white against black plastic. "Who sent it?" "That's the problem. The letter was typed, unsigned. But whoever sent this knows details about your case that weren't made public. They know about Sarah's work in San Francisco, her recent interview for that documentary. They know you've been receiving letters from someone claiming to have information about Webb's death." Frank's chest tightened. "What letters? I haven't received any letters except from Sarah." Chen's silence stretched longer than any stunt fall Frank had ever taken. When his voice returned, it carried the weight of revelation. "Frank, according to prison records, you've been receiving monthly correspondence from someone named Jay Morrison for the past 6 months. The letters were marked legal mail, which means guards couldn't open them. But you're telling me you never got them?" Frank's reflection stared back from the plexiglass, older and harder than the man who'd entered Pelican Bay 7 years ago. Someone had been intercepting his mail. Someone with access to prison systems. Someone who could manipulate records and control information flow. Someone who'd been preparing for this moment. "Chen, someone's been orchestrating this entire thing. The murder, the conviction, everything. They wanted me in this specific cell, in this specific prison. They've been controlling every piece of information I've received for 7 years. Frank, there's something else. The person who sent this footage included a message for you. They said to tell you that Sarah is in danger, and your silence won't protect her anymore. They said the same people who killed Webb are planning something for the 7-year anniversary of your conviction. That's next week." Frank's world tilted sideways. The anniversary he'd been dreading for months wasn't just a personal milestone, it was someone's deadline. 7 years of careful planning, 7 years of keeping him isolated and silent, building towards something that required perfect timing. They want you to break your silence, Frank. They want you to fight back. But they're warning you that once you start, there's no going back. No protection for Sarah, no protection for yourself. Just the truth, whatever it costs. Frank looked through the plexiglass at Martinez, whose rigid posture suggested he was recording every word. The walls of Pelican Bay suddenly felt less like containment and more like concealment, keeping Frank hidden until someone decided he was ready to be unleashed. His 7 years of protective silence had just been shattered. Someone was done waiting. Frank's hand trembled as he set down the phone, the dial tone echoing in the plexiglass booth like a flatlined heartbeat. Martinez stood motionless, his uniform stretched tight across shoulders that hadn't moved in 3 minutes. Too still. Guards never stayed perfectly still unless they were listening to something they weren't supposed to hear. "Time's up, Bronson." Martinez's voice carried a forced casualness that made Frank's skin crawl. "Back to your cell." The walk down the corridor felt different now. Longer, more exposed. Frank caught glimpses of other inmates watching through their door slots, but their usual hungry curiosity had been replaced by something else. Fear. The kind of institutional terror that spread through prison populations when power shifted in ways they couldn't understand but knew would hurt them. In cell 47B, Frank sat on his bunk and stared at the letter from Sarah. His hands shook as he broke the seal, her familiar handwriting blurring before his eyes. "Dad, I can't keep pretending this is normal. 7 years of watching you disappear behind those walls, 7 years of believing you're protecting me from something you won't explain. I'm not 12 anymore. I'm not the scared little girl who needed you to fight her battles. I've been investigating Webb's murder on my own time. The evidence against you was too clean, too perfect. Real crimes are messy. This one was choreographed. Someone called my office yesterday. They wouldn't give their name, but they knew details about my investigation that I've never shared with anyone. They told me to stop digging, or you'd be transferred to a facility where accidents happen more frequently. They knew about my apartment address, my running route, the coffee shop where I work on weekends. I'm scared, Dad. Not of them, of what you're not telling me. Why won't you fight for yourself? What happened that night that made you choose prison over freedom? I love you, but I can't save someone who won't save himself." Frank crushed the letter against his chest, Sarah's words cutting deeper than any stunt injury he'd endured. She was investigating Webb's death. She was attracting attention from people who killed directors and framed stuntmen. Everything Frank had sacrificed to protect her was crumbling because Sarah had inherited his stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The cell door opened without warning. Frank spun around, expecting Martinez, but found Deputy Warden Coleman instead, a thin man with predator eyes who'd spoken to Frank exactly twice in 7 years. Coleman never visited individual cells. He was an administrator, a politician in corrections clothing, who kept his hands clean by maintaining distance from actual prisoners. Bronson. Coleman stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The click of the lock sounded different, final, like a coffin lid sealing. "You had an interesting phone call today." Frank stayed seated on his bunk, forcing his voice steady. "Legal call, my attorney." "Yes, Robert Chen. Good lawyer. Persistent man." Coleman's smile revealed teeth too white and too sharp. "He's been asking questions about your mail delivery, your phone privileges, your cell assignment. Curious questions for a case that was closed years ago." The temperature in the cell seemed to drop 10 degrees. Coleman moved closer, his polished shoes silent on concrete that usually amplified every sound. Prison predators moved quietly. "You know what I find interesting, Bronson? 7 years of perfect behavior. No fights, no contraband, no disciplinary issues. Model prisoner. But today you receive one phone call, and suddenly you're a problem that needs solving." Frank's muscles tensed, stunt training taking over. Coleman was smaller, older, but he hadn't come alone. Through the cell's small window, Frank glimpsed shadows in the corridor, guards positioned strategically, blocking escape routes. "I'm not a problem," Frank said carefully. "No, you're right. You're not a problem." Coleman's hand moved inside his jacket, revealing the outline of something metallic. "Your evidence. Evidence that certain people thought was safely buried. But evidence has a way of surfacing when you least expect it." Frank's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles and distances the way he'd planned stunts. Coleman was 3 feet away, off balance, overconfident. Frank could disarm him, reach the door, maybe make it to the corridor before the other guards reacted. But then what? He was locked inside Pelican Bay with nowhere to run, and Sarah exposed in San Francisco. "Here's what's going to happen," Coleman continued. "You're going to be transferred tomorrow morning. Transport accident. Very unfortunate. These mountain roads can be treacherous, especially in winter weather." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "People know I'm here. My lawyer will receive word that you attacked a guard and died during the altercation. Self-defense. Very tragic, but these things happen in maximum security facilities." Coleman's smile widened. "Your daughter will be devastated, of course. Might even blame herself for reopening old wounds. Guilt makes people do dangerous things." The threat hit Frank like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to kill him. They were going to destroy Sarah emotionally, make her believe her investigation had caused his death. 7 years of protective silence, shattered by someone who'd been playing a longer game than Frank had imagined. Coleman turned toward the door, confident in his control. But he'd made one mistake. He'd revealed the timeline. Frank had until morning to find another option. The cell door closed with its familiar clang, but nothing else would ever be familiar again. Frank pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, watching shadows move in the corridor outside his cell. Coleman's footsteps had faded 20 minutes ago, but the guards remained, dark shapes shifting past his door slot like predators circling wounded prey. They were waiting for something, or someone. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent darkness that reminded Frank of the strobing effects Webb had used during the interrogation scenes in Concrete Angels. Everything connected back to that film, to decisions made in Hollywood boardrooms that had somehow led to this 8x12 concrete tomb. Frank had spent 7 years assuming his silence was protecting Sarah, but now he understood the terrible truth. His silence had been protecting his captors. Sarah's letter crinkled in his trembling hands as he read it again, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I can't save someone who won't save himself." She was right, but she didn't understand the impossible mathematics of his situation. Every move Frank made to protect her had somehow made her more vulnerable. His sacrifice had been worthless, worse than worthless, because it had given his enemies 7 years to perfect their plan. The memory hit him like a stunt gone wrong. Sarah, at 15, crying in his trailer after a particularly brutal day of filming Concrete Angels. She'd watched the dailies against his wishes, seen the scenes of Frank being beaten by actors playing guards. "It's just pretend, sweetheart," he'd whispered, holding her while she sobbed. "None of it's real. I'm safe." But the line between performance and reality had dissolved that final day of shooting. The set had become a crime scene, the props had become weapons, and Frank's protective instincts had become his prison sentence. Someone had orchestrated the perfect frame, using Frank's love for Sarah as the mechanism to ensure his silence. Frank closed his eyes and let the buried memories surface, details he'd forced himself to forget because remembering meant acknowledging how completely he'd been manipulated. Webb's nervous energy during their last conversation hadn't been about studio pressure. It had been fear, pure animal terror of someone who'd realized he was trapped in a conspiracy that reached deeper than he'd imagined. "Frank, I think I made a mistake," Webb had said that night in the trailer, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey that neither of them touched. "The script changes they're demanding. They're not about improving the story. They're about eliminating witnesses." Frank had laughed it off, assuming Webb was paranoid about studio politics. But Webb had been trying to warn him. The director had discovered something about the film's financing, about the real reason certain investors wanted concrete angels made with specific actors in specific locations. The movie had been cover for something larger: money laundering, witness elimination, corruption that connected Hollywood power brokers to prison officials. Webb had died because he'd threatened to expose the truth. Frank had been framed because someone needed a scapegoat who would stay silent to protect his daughter. And Sarah was in danger now because she'd inherited both her father's stubborn loyalty and her mother's investigative instincts. The cell door's lock mechanism clicked, not the heavy clang of normal opening, but the subtle sound of someone with unauthorized access. Frank tensed, expecting Coleman to return with more threats, but the figure who stepped inside made his blood freeze. Martinez stood in the doorway holding a manila envelope, but his usual guard's posture had been replaced by something else: guilt. Shame. The expression of a man who'd been following orders that disgusted him. Bronson Martinez closed the door behind him, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've got something that belongs to you." Frank stayed against the wall, every instinct screaming danger. "What are you talking about?" Martinez opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Frank in unfamiliar handwriting. The return address read J. Morrison, but Frank had never heard that name. These came over the past 6 months. Coleman ordered me to intercept them, told me they were from some obsessed fan who might pose a security risk. Martinez's hands shook as he held out the letters. "But I read them, Frank. They're from someone who knows exactly what happened to Marcus Webb." Frank took the letters with numb fingers, scanning the top envelope's postmark. 6 months ago. Right around the time Sarah had started her investigation. Someone had been trying to contact him, trying to give him information that could have changed everything. "Why are you giving these to me now?" Frank asked. Martinez looked away, unable to meet Frank's eyes. "Because I got a call an hour ago. Someone offered my wife a job in Sacramento, good pay, benefits, everything we've been struggling for since our kid got sick. But the offer expires tomorrow morning, right after your transport." He finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. "They're paying me to look the other way while they kill you." And I almost took it. Frank ripped open the first letter, his eyes racing across handwritten words that changed everything he thought he knew about Marcus Webb's murder. The signature at the bottom made him gasp. Rebecca Chen, still fighting for justice. His dead wife had been investigating his case from beyond the grave. And she'd discovered who really killed Marcus Webb. Frank stared at the signature until the letters blurred together, his mind rejecting what his eyes couldn't deny. Rebecca Chen, his wife, his dead wife, whose funeral he'd watched from a prison transport van 7 years ago, whose grave Sarah visited every month while Frank rotted in solitary confinement. "This is impossible," he whispered, but his hands were already tearing open the second letter, then the third, each one bearing the same impossible signature. The handwriting was Rebecca's, her distinctive loops, the way she crossed her T's, the medical precision that came from years of taking patient notes. Martinez shifted nervously by the door. "Frank, I know how this looks, but she's dead." Frank's voice cracked like breaking glass. "I watched them lower her coffin. Sarah cried for 3 months. The cancer took everything: her hair, her weight, her voice. She died calling my name in a hospital bed while I was locked in this cell. But the letter in his hands told a different story. My dearest Frank, if you're reading this, it means they finally decided you were too dangerous to keep alive. I'm so sorry for what I had to put you through, but there was no other way to keep you and Sarah safe while I worked. The woman who died in that hospital bed was my twin sister, Elena. She volunteered to take my place when we discovered how deep this conspiracy reached. The cancer was real, but Elena had been fighting it for 2 years in secret. She wanted her death to matter, to give me the cover I needed to investigate who really killed Marcus Webb. Frank, I never stopped loving you. Every day you've spent in that cell has been agony for me, but breaking you out would have signed Sarah's death warrant. They needed you alive and silent, a perfect patsy who would never speak because he was protecting his daughter. Your imprisonment was never about justice. It was about buying time for the real killers to eliminate every witness who could expose their operation. Frank's knees gave out. He collapsed onto his bunk, the letter fluttering from nerveless fingers. 7 years. 7 years of grief, of Sarah mourning her mother, of Frank accepting his wife's death as the final cosmic cruelty in a life already destroyed by conspiracy. Rebecca had been alive, working, fighting for his freedom while he'd been planning his own suicide in this concrete box. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Not Rebecca's betrayal. She'd sacrificed everything to save him and Sarah. His own betrayal. The realization that his noble silence, his protective sacrifice, had been exactly what his enemies wanted. They'd played him like a master manipulator working a mark, using his love against him as efficiently as any weapon. Martinez picked up the scattered letters. There's more, Frank. She found out who really killed Webb. She has evidence, video footage, financial records, testimony from witnesses the police never interviewed. She's been building a case that will destroy everyone involved. Frank grabbed the next letter with shaking hands. The man who killed Marcus Webb is Deputy Warden Coleman. He was working security for the film production, taking bribes to ensure certain scenes were shot in specific locations. Marcus discovered that Concrete Angels was being used to launder money from a human trafficking operation. The investors weren't Hollywood executives. They were criminals using the film industry to move cash and people across international borders. The prison set wasn't just a movie location. It was a training ground, teaching traffickers how to move victims through institutional systems without detection. Frank's vision blurred as the words sank in. Webb hadn't just been a director making a gritty prison drama. He'd unknowingly become part of something monstrous, and when he'd discovered the truth, Coleman had silenced him permanently. The murder weapon, the prop knife that had become evidence, had been planted by someone with access to both the film set and the crime scene, someone in law enforcement. Coleman killed him during the rap party, Frank whispered, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. Everyone was drinking, celebrating. Webb confronted him about the money, about what he'd found in the financial records. Coleman lost his temper and used the first weapon he could find. Martinez nodded grimly. Your wife has video footage from a security camera that was supposedly broken that night. Shows Coleman entering Webb's trailer 20 minutes before you found the body. He had blood on his shirt when he came out. Frank's hands shook as he opened another letter, this one shorter but even more devastating. Frank, by the time you read this, they'll have scheduled your execution disguised as a transport accident. I've spent 7 years gathering evidence, but I need something only you can provide. You were the last person to see Marcus alive besides his killer. You told the police Webb seemed nervous, paranoid about studio pressure. But there was something else, wasn't there? Something you didn't tell them because it didn't seem important at the time. Remember, my love. Remember exactly what Marcus said to you that night. His words are the final piece of evidence I need to destroy Coleman and everyone protecting him. Frank closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that trailer 7 years ago. Webb pouring whiskey with trembling hands, his voice pitched high with terror disguised as creative anxiety. Frank had assumed the director was having a breakdown about studio interference. But now Webb's exact words came flooding back with crystal clarity. They want me to reshoot the transfer scene, Webb had said, not looking at Frank directly. Coleman insists we use the actual prison transport route instead of the studio backlot. Says it'll add authenticity, but Frank, I've seen the revised call sheets. Half the crew doesn't know about the location change. It's like they're planning to film something they don't want witnesses to see. Frank's blood turned to ice. The transport accident Coleman had planned for tomorrow morning wasn't improvised. It was a repeat performance. 7 years ago, they'd intended to kill Webb during a fake transport scene, making it look like an accident during filming. When Webb had gotten suspicious and threatened to expose them, Coleman had been forced to improvise the trailer murder instead. But now they had another chance to stage the perfect accident, using the same route Webb had mentioned that night. Frank would die in the exact location where his friend was supposed to have been killed 7 years earlier. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. Martinez. Frank's voice carried a new urgency. I need you to get a message to my daughter. Tell her to contact Detective Morrison. He's the only honest cop who worked Webb's case originally. Tell her to ask him about the transport route Coleman suggested for filming. Ask him why a deputy warden would know so much about mountain roads between here and Pelican Bay. Martinez was already shaking his head. Frank, I can't make unauthorized calls. Coleman is going to kill both of us no matter what you do. Frank stood up, his stuntman's instincts taking over. You think they're going to let you live after you witness this conversation? After you read my wife's letters? You're not just a guard anymore, Martinez. You're a liability. The truth hit Martinez like a physical blow. His face went pale as he realized the impossible position he'd put himself in. By choosing conscience over corruption, he'd signed his own death warrant. Frank continued pressing his advantage. But if we move first, if we get this evidence to people who can use it, we both have a chance. Your wife's job offer in Sacramento, it's not a reward, it's bait. They want your family in a controlled location where accidents can happen more easily. Through the cell's small window, Frank saw shadows shifting in the corridor again. Different guards this time, moving with military precision. Coleman wasn't waiting until morning. The timeline had accelerated. Martinez pulled out his radio, his finger hovering over the call button. What exactly do you want me to tell your daughter? Frank grabbed the man's wrist, staring directly into his eyes. Tell her that her mother is alive. Tell her that Deputy Warden Coleman killed Marcus Webb. And tell her that if she doesn't move tonight, she'll be attending 2 more funerals tomorrow. The radio crackled to life before Martinez could respond. Coleman's voice cutting through the static like a blade. All units to cell block D. We have a situation that requires immediate resolution. Time had just run out. Martinez's finger froze over the radio button as heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Too many guards moving with too much purpose. Frank counted at least 6 distinct voices, all coordinated, all converging on his cell. This wasn't standard protocol. This was an execution squad. Martinez, whatever you're going to do it now, Frank whispered, pressing Rebecca's letters into the guard's trembling hands. Hide these. Get them to Sarah. Everything depends on... The cell door exploded inward with a crash that shook the concrete walls. Coleman stepped through first, flanked by 4 guards Frank didn't recognize. Private contractors, not prison personnel. Their tactical gear gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and their faces held the cold professionalism of men who'd done this before. Step away from the prisoner, Martinez. Coleman's voice carried absolute authority, but Frank caught the slight tremor underneath. The deputy warden was terrified, operating on pure desperation now that his timeline had collapsed. You're relieved of duty effective immediately. Martinez clutched the letters against his chest, his radio still in his other hand. Frank could see the man's internal war playing out across his face. Duty versus conscience, family safety versus moral obligation. 7 years in solitary had taught Frank to read people with microscopic precision, and Martinez was one heartbeat away from making a choice that would define the rest of his life. Sir, I need to file an incident report first, Martinez said, his voice steadier than Frank had expected. Prisoner Bronson received unauthorized correspondence that requires documentation. Coleman's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the panic beneath. Give me those letters, Martinez, now. I can't do that, sir. Martinez stepped backward, positioning himself between Frank and the door. These are evidence in an ongoing investigation. They need to go through proper channels. Frank watched Coleman's hand drift toward his service weapon, recognizing the exact moment when negotiation ended and violence began. The deputy warden's fatal flaw had always been his need for control. When that control slipped, he became reckless, dangerous, prone to the kind of mistakes that had gotten Marcus Webb killed in a trailer 7 years ago. "You stupid bastard," Coleman hissed. "Do you have any idea what you're interfering with? The money involved? The people who will—" "I know exactly what I'm interfering with." Martinez's finger moved to his radio's emergency button, not the standard call frequency, but the direct line to state authorities that bypassed all local channels. "Deputy Warden Coleman, you're under citizen's arrest for the murder of Marcus Webb." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Frank felt 7 years of suffocating silence finally crack open, as the truth exploded into the fluorescent-lit space between them. Coleman's face went white, then purple with rage, his hand closing around his weapon's grip. But Martinez was faster than anyone expected. The young guard's thumb jammed down on the emergency button as he shouted into the radio, "This is Officer Martinez at Pelican Bay, Cell Block D. Deputy Warden Coleman has just confessed to murdering Director Marcus Webb. I have evidence of a conspiracy involving prisoner Frank Bronson, requesting immediate backup and state investigation." Coleman drew his weapon, but Frank was already moving. 7 years of confined space training kicked in as he launched himself forward, using the cell's narrow dimensions to his advantage. His shoulder caught Coleman in the solar plexus, driving both men into the concrete wall with bone-jarring force. "The transport route," Frank gasped, wrestling for Coleman's gun. "Webb knew about the transport route. You told him where you were going to kill him." Coleman's eyes went wide with genuine terror, not fear of death, but fear of exposure. "You don't understand," he wheezed. "This goes all the way to Washington. They'll kill everyone, your daughter, your wife, everyone who knows." "My wife is already dead because of you." Frank's rage gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. "You made my daughter mourn her mother for 7 years. You stole everything from us." "No." Coleman's voice cracked with desperate honesty. "She's alive, Bronson. Rebecca's alive. But if this gets out, if the trafficking network gets exposed, they'll hunt her down like an animal. Your silence was protecting her." The words hit Frank like a physical blow, but Martinez's voice cut through his shock. "State police are en route. Lockdown initiated. All units stand down." Frank looked into Coleman's eyes and saw the truth written there. Not just guilt, but genuine terror for Rebecca's safety. The deputy warden had been trapped in this conspiracy just as completely as Frank, protecting his own family while destroying others. They were both victims of something larger, more monstrous than either had imagined. "Then we end it," Frank whispered, his hands still locked around Coleman's throat. "Right here, right now, we give them everything we know and trust the law to protect the people we love." Coleman's weapon clattered to the floor as sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The truth was finally free. Frank released his grip and stepped back, watching Coleman collapse against the wall, gasping. The sirens were getting louder, real sirens this time, not the orchestrated chaos of a cover-up. Through the cell's small window, he could see headlights cutting through the darkness. State police vehicles flooding the prison parking lot like cavalry arriving at the last possible moment. Martinez was still shouting into his radio, coordinating with authorities who existed outside Coleman's sphere of influence. The young guard's voice carried a strength Frank hadn't heard before, the sound of a man who'd found his conscience and decided to live with the consequences. Frank Coleman's voice was barely a whisper. "Your wife, she's been staying in a safe house in Oregon. Federal witness protection. The trafficking network spans 5 states, involves 3 congressional offices, and has been using Hollywood productions to move money for 8 years. Rebecca's testimony will destroy all of it, but only if she stays hidden until the trials begin." Frank knelt beside the broken man who'd orchestrated his 7-year nightmare. Up close, Coleman looked older, hollowed out by the same forces that had consumed Frank's life. They were both actors in someone else's script, reading lines they'd never chosen. "Where in Oregon?" Frank asked quietly. "I don't know." Coleman closed his eyes. "That was the point. Even I couldn't compromise her location under interrogation. She contacts her handlers through a library in Portland, leaves coded messages in book returns. She's been watching Sarah from a distance, every graduation, every birthday, every visit to Elena's grave. The weight of 7 years crashed down on Frank all at once. While he'd been planning suicide in this concrete box, Rebecca had been alive, watching their daughter grow up from the shadows. While Sarah had been mourning her mother, Rebecca had been sacrificing her own freedom to build the case that would eventually free them all. The scope of the deception, the magnitude of the love that had sustained it, left Frank breathless. State police poured into the corridor outside, their voices sharp with authority. Frank heard Detective Morrison's familiar growl directing the operation, the one honest cop who'd always suspected there was more to Webb's murder than a jealous stuntman's rage. Martinez appeared in the doorway, flanked by federal agents. "Frank, they need to debrief you immediately. Everything you remember about that night, about Coleman's involvement, about the transport route Webb mentioned. Your testimony is the final piece they need to make arrests across the entire network." Frank stood slowly, feeling his body move differently than it had in years. The suffocating weight of silence was gone, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: purpose. Not the desperate purpose of survival, but the steady purpose of a man who finally understood his role in a story larger than his own pain. "My daughter," he said to Morrison as the detective entered the cell. "She needs to know about her mother before this hits the news." Morrison nodded grimly. "Federal marshals are already en route to Sarah's apartment. She'll be in protective custody within the hour, and they'll explain everything. After tomorrow's arrests, the immediate threat should be neutralized." Frank looked around the tiny cell one last time, the concrete walls that had enclosed his world for 7 years, the narrow bunk where he'd planned his own death just hours earlier. The space looked smaller now, almost quaint compared to the vast conspiracy it had hidden him from. This cell had been his prison, but it had also been his shield, protecting him from forces that would have destroyed him completely if he'd faced them unprepared. 3 hours later, Frank stood in a federal courthouse conference room, wearing civilian clothes that felt strange against skin that had known only prison uniforms. Through the window, he could see the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains, the same mountains where Coleman had planned to stage his transport accident. Instead, Frank was watching the sunrise as a free man for the first time in 7 years. The door opened, and Morrison entered with a woman Frank almost didn't recognize. Rebecca had aged, her black hair now shot through with silver, her face carrying lines of stress and sacrifice. But her eyes were exactly the same, warm, intelligent, filled with the love that had sustained them both through their separate prisons. She crossed the room slowly, as if approaching a man who might disappear if she moved too quickly. Frank met her halfway, his hands finding hers with the muscle memory of 23 years of marriage. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his chest. "For Elena, for the funeral, for letting you believe—" "You saved us," Frank interrupted, his voice rough with 7 years of disuse. "All of us. You saved everyone." Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of the longest night of Frank Bronson's life. Tomorrow there would be trials, testimony, the slow work of rebuilding a family fractured by necessity. But today there was only this moment. 2 people who had loved each other enough to endure separate hells, finally free to love each other in the light. The truth had cost them 7 years, but it had also given them the rest of their lives.